Hello, grade 12s. Welcome back. It's Economics with Ms. Piwe, and today we are focusing on inflation. So now we are going to move on to cost push inflation. So let's expand on this concept. So cost push inflation is caused by an increase in the cost of goods or services that are very important to the economy and for which no alternatives exist. So it's important that we are aware of what really causes this cost push inflation. So here we are dealing with an increase in the cost of goods or services that are very important. So these are not goods that we can actually do without. So they're very important to the economy, and also there are no alternatives for these goods. Examples can be spikes in the oil price due to war, huge price rises in essential food products due to drought, and also an excessive increase an excessive increase in the cost of labor due to control of industries by trade unions. So some of the characteristics of cost push inflation are. So we are looking at cost push inflation, and we know these are some of the examples of these goods that are very important to the economy, and we know that we don't have alternatives for these goods. We know that the oil price as well, we need oil for all sorts of things. So if there's a war, that could cause an increase in this. Also, the essential food products might go up due to drought. And I know that in our country for the past couple of years, we have been dealing with this particular challenge, and also an excessive increase in the cost of labor due to control of the industries by trade unions, because the trade unions are now introducing things like, the minimum wage. So other industries may find that to be quite expensive, and therefore they might be in a situation where they actually decide that they are going to retrench some of their employees. Also, an increase in labor costs has contributed significantly in this regard. So aggressive trade union negotiations push the price of labor up above the increase in the productivity. We know the negotiations, when the union says, tools down, we're not going to work. We know the losses that the business often incurs as a result of that. So these very hectic and aggressive negotiations have actually pushed the price of labor up, and it's actually gone above the increase in production. So producers increase profits, so prices rise more than the rise in production costs, because now they're trying to keep up with all these developments that have been happening. So with trade unions having all these expectations in terms of salaries and remuneration, and also them trying to stay afloat and having an income in terms of what they are offering. So the state imposes a higher VAT rate, so that is our value-added tax. So the state will then impose this, and then that will cause this type of inflation. So the causes of cost push inflation, the first point that we're going to discuss is the wages. So an increase in wages constitutes or will constitute 50% of the GVA at basic prices, and is one of the major causes of cost push inflation. So over here we chatted about the fact that now you have trade unions who are involved, and they make these aggressive negotiations that we mentioned over here. So the price of labor becomes very expensive as compared to the cost or the price of production. So the price of labor actually goes above the price of the actual production process, and then this results in a situation where we are dealing with cost push inflation. So the key inputs need to be taken into consideration as well. So when the prices of key inputs are imported, so we are paying a fee to bring them into the country. So the domestic cost of production increases, especially in the manufacturing sector. We know that the ideal situation for us is for us to export goods and services to other countries, but when we bring in goods and services from other countries into our country, we do incur the exchange rate costs that are associated with imports as well. Also, the exchange rate depreciation, I've just mentioned that with import and exports, we deal with the exchange rate. So when there is a depreciation in the exchange rate, so the depreciation in the rand will lead to more expensive imports. So because the rand will be considered to be weaker in value, so when we are paying for our imports, we are going to end up paying more money because the currency of those countries that we are trading with is stronger than the rand. So if the rand is weaker, so it is costing us much more to actually bring in those goods into our country. If those goods are essential to the citizens of a country, then South Africa will have to ensure that they do bring them into the country. Also looking at issues around the profit margins that exist. So when businesses increase their profit margins, their cost of production and the prices or the price of consumers or the prices that consumers pay will also increase. Okay, so we know that consumers are always very skeptical when it comes to paying high prices, or they often complain about paying these high prices because businesses and firms want to hike up their profits. So in order to achieve that, they will have to increase the price of the products that they offer. Another point that we need to consider is productivity. So when there is less productive factors of production, so when we have less production factors of production, this will lead to increased cost per unit. Because economic centers around this topic, the fact that we've got less limit, or we've got less, or we have limited resources or scarce resources, so then the cost per unit becomes quite high based on the fact that we have less productive factors that are available at our disposal. Natural disasters, we don't have control over these, but they do have a huge impact when it comes to this type of inflation. So prices will increase due to weather changes such as droughts, floods, and also global warming. And we have seen this when there is a natural disaster, when there is a drought, then the prices of items or products will increase as a result of this difficulty that is faced by different industries. So they will have to hike up the prices because there will be too many people chasing after few goods and services, and then that will create a situation where we are dealing with inflation. So what can be done in order to manage inflation? Because we have looked at what inflation is, we have looked at some of the causes of inflation, but we know that it is important for us to develop strategies to respond to the challenges that are brought about by inflation. So what can be done? What measures can we put in place in order to ensure that we can respond positively to the challenges that are brought by inflation? So we start by looking at policymakers. So policymakers can use various policy measures to fight inflation when it gets too high. Three types of policy measures are highlighted. So policy, because here we are dealing with a decision that is made by the Minister of Finance and the Monetary Policy Committee. Those are the bodies or the structures that monitor inflation in our country and also that regulate the targeting of inflation in our country. So it's important that we revisit these policies because they will help us to manage or to fight inflation so that it stays within those targets that are stipulated by the Minister of Finance. So starting with fiscal measures. So fiscal measures are the measures taken by the Minister of Finance regarding taxation and also expenditure. So if we study these policies and we use them well, they can actually help us to reduce or to lower the inflation rate in our country. Examples of measures that can be taken include an increase in direct taxation. So I'm going to pull my screen up so that we can see this information. There we are. So if there's an increase in direct taxation, that is the personal income tax, which will then help to decrease demand for certain products. And remember, we work on the system, the higher you earn, and that's the higher, well, you will fall in a very high tax bracket, so you will pay more tax as a result of that, because that's part of the redistribution policy that we have as a country. Also, when you have an increase in the indirect taxation, that is through value-added tax, it does cause spending to decrease because goods become more expensive. So these are some of the fiscal policies or fiscal measures that can be used in order to fight inflation. And also a loan levy that can be charged or that can be charged on loans will then reduce the disposable income of consumers. So consumers will have less to spend, and therefore that will result in a situation where we minimize the general increase in prices. Then the next point, the state cuts back on expenditure by cancelling government projects like roads, hospitals and schools, and this should be the last resort, because we need these infrastructures to be developed because we want our children to have access to schooling and to good health facilities, and we want proper roads in order to conduct business and to make sure that our economy runs in an efficient manner. Then we've looked at the fiscal measures. Now it's time to look at the monetary measures that can be used. So the South African Reserve Bank and the government can apply certain monetary measures in order to curb inflation. So what is it that can be done from a monetary angle or perspective? So the Reserve Bank could adjust the quantity of money to the needs of the economy. Because remember, when we have too much money floating in the economy, that results in high levels of inflation. So we don't want that situation. So what the Reserve Bank can do is to adjust the quantity of money that will be based on the needs of the economy or the residents of the country. So through open market policy, this can be achieved. So I'm going to move my screen up. So we can use market policy to achieve this, and also maintaining a fine balance between supply of goods and services and also the money supply. So the relationship between the supply of goods and also the money that is supplied by the Reserve Bank is very important because we can use that in order to ensure that we control our inflation and that it stays within the target of 3% and 6%. The Reserve Bank can also lower the inflation using the excess demand, or by the excess demand that they can use in terms of what is supplied. So the South African Reserve Bank curbs inflation caused by excess demand by reducing the money supply. So if they reduce the money that is supplied in the economy, then they will then reduce the demand as well for products, because there is limited money that is supplied by the Reserve Bank, and therefore it will directly affect the demand in the economy. The bank rate of the central bank, which is the Reserve Bank, affects the interest rates in the economy because of the repo rate. So remember, I said the banks approach the Reserve Bank if they want a loan, and then the Reserve Bank will charge them a repo rate. And then in return, the banks will charge us an interest rate if we go and take out a loan from a bank. So they can use the system of a repo rate in order to control the amount of money in circulation. All right, so let's then sum up our lessons. So today we've learned a lot about inflation and the different types of inflation. So in this lesson, we covered the following concepts. We looked at inflation and we said it occurs when there is a sustained and significant increase in the general price levels over a period of time. At the same time, there is a decline in the buying power of money. In other words, the general price level increases more than the general increase in wages or salaries, and then that results in a situation where we will be dealing with inflation. We've looked at demand pull inflation, and we said it occurs when aggregate demand in an economy outpaces or is faster than the aggregate supply, even though the gross domestic product rises and unemployment falls. Effectively, too much money is spent chasing too few goods. Generally, an increase in the supply of the demanded goods will reverse the inflationary trend. So when there is an increase in the supply, that will help to reverse this trend. Then we also looked at the cost push inflation. It is caused by an increase in the cost of goods or services that are very important to the economy. So we do need these goods and we can't live without them. So therefore, we will have to purchase these goods, and for which there are no alternatives. So we will have to find means and ways to access these goods. Well, that's a wrap from me, Ospiwe. I hope you've learned so much from this lesson. Ngithini nonke, nginithanda nonke emakhaya.